The air inside the small dressing room was thick with the scent of old hymnals and the lingering aroma of communion wine. Grace leaned against the cool stone wall, her heart drumming a rhythm that had nothing to do with the choir songs she had just finished singing. Standing before her was David, his hands rough from a day at the carpenter's bench, but his eyes as soft as the morning mist. When he leaned in and their lips finally met, the world outside the church rules, the village whispers, and her father's stern expectations vanish. It was a kiss that tasted of freedom and forbidden dreams. Suddenly, the heavy wooden door creaked open. The afternoon light shone in, illuminating two figures frozen in a terrified embrace. Standing in the doorway was Sister Ruth, her face twisted into a mask of calculated horror. She didn't scream. Instead, she let out a slow, poisonous gasp that felt louder than a thunderclap. "Abomination," she said, her eyes darting between Grace's disheveled hair and David's simple carpenter's tunic. "In the very house of the Lord!" Before Grace could find her voice to explain, Sister Ruth had already turned, her heels clicking rapidly against the floorboards as she hurried toward the main sanctuary where Pastor Solomon was concluding a meeting with the elders. Grace was the daughter of the most powerful man in the village. Her father, Pastor Solomon, was a man whose shadow loomed large over every household. He was a pillar of fire and holiness, a man who spoke of grace but lived by the law. Grace had always been his perfect child, the lead singer, the Sunday school teacher, the pride of every young lady in the church. But her heart had wandered far from the paved paths of the church. She had fallen for David, a boy who lived on the outskirts of the village. David was a master with wood, a very talented and skilled carpenter, but in the eyes of the congregation, he carried a stain that no amount of prayer could wash away. He came from a shrine family. His grandfather had been the chief priest of the old ways, and though David himself spent his days building chairs and tables for the villagers, the church elders still looked at him and saw the smoke of ancient evil altars. "Run, David," Grace whispered, her face pale. "Please, just go." But David stood his ground, his jaw set in a line of quiet defiance. "I am not a thief, Grace. I love you. I will not run like a man who has committed a crime." Moments later, the dressing room door was kicked open. Pastor Solomon entered like a storm, followed by a huddle of whispering elders and the smirking Sister Ruth. The silence that followed was suffocating. The pastor looked at his daughter, then at the carpenter's son, and his face turned the color of bruised plums. The scandal had begun. The news of what happened in the dressing room spread faster than a bushfire in the dry season. By the time the sun began to set, every kitchen and marketplace stall was buzzing with the story. Sister Ruth had made sure of it. She walked from house to house, shaking her head and pretending to be sad, but her heart was dancing with joy. She had always wanted David to marry her own daughter, Sarah, but David never looked Sarah's way. Now, she had the perfect weapon to destroy him. Inside the church sanctuary, the atmosphere was cold. Pastor Solomon sat on his high wooden chair, his Bible closed tightly on his lap. Grace stood before him, her head bowed and her hands trembling. David stood beside her, his shoulders square, refusing to look like a defeated man. The elders sat in a semicircle, their faces as hard as carved stone. "Grace," Pastor Solomon began, his voice low and vibrating with anger, "you are the daughter of a lion. You are the example for every girl in this village, and yet you chose to bring shame to this altar with a boy whose blood is mixed with the soil of idols?" "Papa, it is not like that," Grace pleaded, her voice breaking. "David is a good man. He works hard. He loves God in his own way." "His own way is not our way," the pastor barked, slamming his hand on the arm of his chair. The sound echoed through the empty hall. He turned his eyes toward David, eyes filled with a holy rage. "You, carpenter, you crept into my house like a snake. You used your charms to turn my daughter's heart away from her duties. From this moment, you are banned. Do not step foot on this holy ground again. If I see you near my daughter or this church, the guards will handle you." David looked the pastor in the eye. "I have no charms, sir. Only a heart that cares for your daughter. Love is not a sin." The elders gasped at his boldness. "Silence!" one shouted. "How dare you speak to the man of God?" Pastor Solomon pointed a finger at Grace. "As for you, you are suspended. No choir, no teaching. You will stay in the parsonage and you will fast until your spirit is clean again. You have forgotten who you are, but I will remind you." Sister Ruth stepped forward then, her voice dripping with fake honey. "Pastor, we must also think of the future. The people are talking. Perhaps Grace needs a strong, godly man to lead her back to the right path. Someone like Brother Kingsley, the son of Elder Okoro." The pastor nodded slowly. The idea took root in his mind. Brother Kingsley was wealthy and powerful. A marriage to him would bury the scandal and bring more influence to the church. Grace looked at her father in horror. She knew Kingsley. He was a man who used his father's money to boss people around. He didn't want a wife, he wanted a trophy. As David was dragged out of the church by the ushers, Grace felt a cold wall rising between her and her father. The life she knew was crumbling, and the man who was supposed to protect her was the one holding the hammer. The days that followed were long and silent inside the pastor's house. Grace was no longer the shining star of the village. She was like a bird with clipped wings, confined to the shadows of the parsonage. Every morning, the church bells rang, but she was not allowed to lead the singing. Instead, she spent her hours scrubbing floors and sitting in forced silence. Her father, Pastor Solomon, acted as if she were a ghost, looking through her with eyes made of ice. While Grace suffered in silence, Brother Kingsley began to visit. He did not come with flowers or kind words. He came with expensive gifts of lace and gold jewelry, dropping them on the table as if he were buying a piece of land. Kingsley was a man who walked with a heavy, boastful stride. He was the son of the wealthiest elder, and he believed that everything in the village had a price tag, including Grace. Pastor Solomon welcomed Kingsley with open arms. To the pastor, this marriage was the only way to wash away the dirt David had left behind. He told the village that Grace was recovering her spirit, and soon she would be the wife of a great man. But behind the closed doors of the house, Grace's mother, Lady Maria, watched her daughter with a heavy heart. She saw the way Grace's eyes filled with tears whenever Kingsley's name was mentioned. Lady Maria knew this pain too well, for she had lived in a marriage of duty, not love, for 20 years. One evening, the air was heavy with the smell of coming rain. Kingsley found Grace alone on the back porch. He did not ask how she felt. He stood too close, his breath smelling of expensive tobacco and pride. He told her that she was lucky he was willing to take a soiled woman like her. When he reached out to grab her arm, his grip was not gentle. It was the grip of a man who wanted to own a slave, not a partner. Grace felt a cold shiver of fear run down her spine. Kingsley's eyes were dark with a desire to control her. He laughed when she tried to pull away, telling her that the wedding date was already being discussed by the elders. At that moment, Grace realized that the church she loved had become a prison. Her father was the jailer, and Kingsley was the chain. That night, as the village slept, Grace looked out her window toward the forest path. She thought of David's gentle hands and the way he respected her. She realized that staying meant losing her soul. With nothing but a small bundle of clothes and a heart full of terror, she waited for the clouds to cover the moon. She knew that if she didn't run now, she would be buried alive in a life she hated. The moon was hidden by thick clouds as Grace stepped out of the house. She moved like a shadow, her feet familiar with the stones and roots of the village paths. Every bark of a distant dog made her heart jump, but she did not stop. She was leaving behind the only life she knew, trading the comfort of the parsonage for the uncertainty of the dark forest. By the time the first light of morning touched the sky, Grace was far away, hiding in a small village where no one knew she was a pastor's daughter. Back in the village, the morning brought a great storm of confusion. When Lady Maria entered Grace's room and found the bed empty, she did not scream. Instead, she sat on the edge of the bed and let out a long, quiet sigh. She found a small note tucked under the pillow, but she quickly hid it in her bosom before her husband could enter. When Pastor Solomon realized his daughter was gone, his fury was like a physical heat. He did not worry about her safety. He worried about his reputation. Brother Kingsley was even more insulted. He had told everyone that Grace would be his, and now he looked like a fool. He shouted at the pastor, demanding that the girl be found and brought back in chains if necessary. The elders gathered, whispering that the shrine boy must have bewitched her to run away. Meanwhile, David had been living in a neighboring town, working day and night to save every coin. He did not know that Grace had run away. He only knew that he could not live without her. He spent his hours carving a beautiful wooden box, pouring all his love and longing into the wood. He decided that he would no longer hide. He would return to the village, face the lion in his den, and ask for Grace's hand properly. David arrived at the village square 2 weeks later. He walked straight to the pastor's house, carrying his tools and his dignity. The villagers gathered, expecting a fight. When David stood before Pastor Solomon, the air was tight with tension. "I have come to ask for Grace," David said, his voice steady and clear. "I have a house and a trade. I can care for her." The pastor laughed, a bitter and dry sound. "You are too late, carpenter. The girl you're looking for has become a wanderer. She has shamed this house and fled into the night. She is no longer my daughter." The news hit David like a blow to the chest. He looked at the angry faces of the elders and the mocking smile of Sister Ruth. He realized then that Grace hadn't just run away from him. She had run away from the cruelty of this place. Without a word of fear, David turned around. He knew what he had to do. If Grace were a wanderer, then he would wander until he found her. David did not waste time. He traveled from village to village, stopping at every marketplace and stream. He described Grace to everyone he met, the girl with the voice of a bird and eyes that held the calm of a morning pond. His feet grew weary and his clothes became dusty, but his heart remained focused. He worked small jobs along the way, fixing broken doors and carving bowls to pay for his bread, always moving toward the next horizon. Back in the parsonage, a heavy darkness had settled. Pastor Solomon had officially declared that Grace was dead to the family. He forbade anyone from mentioning her name. He spent his days preaching louder than ever, his sermons full of fire and punishment. He wanted to prove to the village that he was still a man of God, even if his own home was broken. But the pews felt emptier, and the songs in the church sounded hollow without Grace's high, clear notes. While the pastor grew harder, Lady Maria, the pastor's wife, Grace's mother, grew bolder in secret. She knew exactly where Grace was hiding because of the note she had found. Every week, she sent a trusted messenger, a young boy who worked in her garden, to the neighboring town. Inside the small bundles the boy carried were not just food and clothes, but letters of love. Lady Maria wrote to Grace, telling her to stay strong and not to look back. She sent her own gold bangles, the ones she had received on her wedding day, so that Grace would have money to survive. Lady Maria was tired of living in fear. She remembered her own youth, how she was handed over to the pastor like a piece of property. She saw Grace's escape as her own victory. When Sister Ruth came to the house to gossip and celebrate Grace's downfall, Lady Maria no longer smiled politely. She pointed to the door and told the woman to take her poisonous tongue elsewhere. One afternoon, in a small town 2 days' journey away, David was sitting by a roadside workshop when he saw a familiar figure. It was the garden boy from the parsonage, carrying a bundle wrapped in Lady Maria's signature green cloth. David stood up, his heart leaping. He followed the boy through narrow paths until they reached a small, neat hut at the edge of a forest. The door opened, and there stood Grace. She was thinner, and her hands were rough from farm work, but when she saw David, her face lit up like 1,000 lamps. They did not need many words. The silence of the forest was filled with the sound of two hearts finally finding their rhythm again. They knew the world they left behind would never accept them, but in that small hut, they realized they were finally home. In that quiet town, far from the prying eyes of Sister Ruth and the heavy hand of the pastor, Grace and David began a new life. They did not have a grand cathedral or a choir of 100 voices. Instead, they had a small clearing beneath a giant iroko tree. They invited a few neighbors they had befriended and a local magistrate. With simple rings carved from mahogany by David's own hands, they promised to love and protect each other. It was a wedding of peace, free from the noise of religious politics and family pride. David's skill as a carpenter quickly earned him a good name in the new land. He built roofs that did not leak and chairs that lasted for generations. Grace, no longer suspended or shamed, began to teach the village children under the shade of the trees. Her voice, once used to please her father's congregation, now sang songs of joy to a community that saw her as a woman, not a scandal. They lived in a small house that smelled of fresh wood and spicy stews, building a world out of the clay the pastor had once looked down upon. But even in their happiness, a shadow of sadness remained. Grace often thought of her mother, Lady Maria, wondering if she was lonely in that big, silent parsonage. She also thought of her father. She did not hate him, but she mourned the man he used to be before his position became more important than his blood. She knew that in the eyes of her old village, she was a ghost, a name whispered in warning to other young girls. The months passed, and the Harmattan dust began to settle over the land. The news of their quiet success eventually reached their home village. Travelers spoke of the master carpenter and his beautiful wife who sang like an angel. When Pastor Solomon heard these reports, he would walk away in silence, his face hardening. He had tried to bury his daughter's happiness, but it was growing like a seed in fertile soil. One evening, Lady Maria sat by her window, watching the moon. She had heard the news of the wedding and the new house. For the first time in many years, she felt a sense of completion. She had lost a daughter to distance, but she had saved a soul from the same cage that held her. She took out a piece of parchment and a quill. She knew that soon a special day was coming, a day the townspeople called Valentine's, a day for lovers. She began to write a plan, a final act of motherhood that would bridge the gap between the palace of religion and the house of love. The morning of Valentine's Day arrived with a soft breeze that carried the scent of drying grass and blooming jasmine. In their small, happy home, Grace and David shared a simple meal of roasted yams and garden eggs. There were no grand celebrations in their new village, but the air felt different, lighter, and full of peace. David looked at Grace and placed a small, polished wooden heart he had carved into her hand. It was a day to celebrate the love that had survived the fire. Later that afternoon, a knock sounded at their heavy wooden door. Standing there was the same garden boy from the parsonage, dusty from a long journey but wearing a wide smile. He handed Grace a thick envelope sealed with a drop of red wax. Grace's hands shook as she recognized her mother's elegant handwriting on the front, but inside there was a second piece of paper, one that made her breath catch in her throat. The first letter was from Lady Maria. She wrote of her pride and her joy, telling Grace that the village was changing. She whispered that the truth about Sister Ruth's lies and Brother Kingsley's cruelty had finally come to light, and the elders were starting to see the holes in their own judgment. But it was the second, smaller note that brought tears to Grace's eyes. It was written in the thick, bold strokes of her father, Pastor Solomon. The note was short. It did not offer a full apology, and it did not take back the harsh words of the past. It simply said, "The house is too quiet. The songs are missing their soul. I am learning that the law is nothing without mercy. Happy Valentine's Day, my daughter." Grace leaned against David, the tears falling freely now. It was not the perfect ending where everything was forgotten, but it was a start. The cost of her authenticity had been high. She had lost her home, her position, and her father's approval for a long time. But as she looked around her warm house and felt David's arm around her, she knew she had gained something much more valuable, a life that was truly her own. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Grace sat on her porch and began to sing. It wasn't a hymn of fear or a song of duty. It was a song of a heart that had been broken, but was now mended by the strength of a love that refused to die. In the distance, the village drums began to beat, echoing the rhythm of a new beginning.